name is Mason Toms, and I work at the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program with CALI, which is a division of the Department of Arkansas Heritage, well, formerly the Department of Arkansas Heritage, now Parks, Heritage, and Tourism. Thank you for coming, and welcome to the Stebbins Roberts Building, now home to Cromwell Architects and Engineers. Constructed in 1947, the Stebbins Roberts Building is a late example of Art Deco style architecture with modern accents in Arkansas by the Little Rock architectural firm of Burks and Anderson. But first, we're going to do a little bit about this area. Prior to the arrival of the railroad in 1873, the area surrounding the Stebbins and Roberts Building was predominantly residential in nature. This is kind of the area we're looking at. It was characterized by large swaths of open space dotted by single-family houses. The only exception of this was the area of light industrial use that was concentrated on the north along the banks of the Arkansas River. So right here was a little bit of industrial. But the arrival of the railroad gradually began to increase the number of industrial structures in the area, but it still maintained a strong residential core. So this is the 1887 bird's eye, and you can see there's a lot more industrial stuff in the area, but there's still a lot of houses too. The largest post-Civil War business in the area was the Little Rock Oil and Compress Company, a cottonseed oil mill, which is actually right there. And it arrived in the 1880s and was located between 2nd Street and the Arkansas River, east of Bird Street. Sanborn maps show the mill surrounded by a small rope and twine mill, an infirmary, and small single-story dwellings, some of which were actually labeled Negro dwellings. However, Union Compress was destroyed in a fire in 1896. Additional industrial activity in the area concentrated along the banks of the Arkansas River, and was mainly limited to between Cumberland and Bird Street and along the rail lines. Several of these companies that existed at this time was the B.B. Stave Company, the Little Rock Grain Company, the Little Rock Mill and Elevator Company, and several cotton mills. However, south of 3rd Street still stayed mainly residential. By the early 20th century, the growth of railroads, including the arrival of the Rock Island and Missouri Pacific rail lines on the eastern edge of the city, saw an increasing number of heavy industrial constructions, such as foundries, cotton mills, freight yards, lumber yards, brick yards, and furniture factories in the area. These facilities were well connected to downtown Little Rock to the west through main thoroughfares of 3rd, 6th, and 9th Streets. The 1939 Sanborn map, which this is kind of a collage of several 1939 Sanborn maps, shows the area. Shows that several clusters of industrial development lining the numerous arms of the Missouri Pacific and Rock Island tracks east of Bird Street. And you can see how much of this area was devoted to the rail line just by how many railroad tracks are crisscrossing it. The city directory for the same year lists the commercial entities in the area to include Southern Ice Company, a furniture warehouse, Gregory Robertson Vinegar Company, auto repair shops, the Dar Building Supply Company, various warehouses, and a Stebbins and Roberts warehouse, which is no longer existent. That building wasn't, and it was in a different spot. So this little star down here is actually where we are today. So this is 1939, and you can see there was nothing really over in this area except for rail line stuff. And that's what underneath the star, you can see the lot line. That was actually a house. So there was a house here in 39. By the 1950s, several more industrial manufacturers were present in the area, including the Diskey Equipment Company, Little Rock Box and Machine Company, the National Refrigeration Company, Banner Mattress and Rug Company, the Kraft Food Company, and all of these were located between 2nd and 6th Streets. So a little bit about the company when that's here, the paint company, the Stebbins and Roberts Company. In 1914, A.H. Stebbins and Garner Goldsmith started a modest sign painting business in the basement of a small commercial building on West 6th Street in downtown Little Rock. 2 years later, they expanded to manufacturing a small line of paints called Stebbins and Goldsmith. And this is actually the color sample of some of their paints, which led them to expand into the retail space above their basement workshop. In 1919, Lindsay Roberts, the son of well-known Pulaski County plantation owner, bought Goldsmith's interest and changed the name of the company to Stebbins and Roberts. The company expanded their retail operation and began producing a larger line of paints, S&G brand, which this is the S&G paints, which was quickly acquired by Benjamin Moore. Stebbins and Roberts then became the sole distributor of Benjamin Moore paints in the state of Arkansas. The company continued to grow, and with sales agents in many towns around Arkansas, selling Benjamin Moore paints as well as linseed oil and wallpaper. In 1923, Stebbins reported that the company sold 32 carloads of paint and wallpaper. That's rail car loads, not a sedan, which is quite a bit. In 1924, a newspaper article about the company, Stebbins stated that the volume of his business is evidence beyond doubt of prosperity in general in Little Rock, as well as smaller towns throughout the state, and credited the post-World War construction boom for his growth in sales. By spring of 1942, the company carried a stock worth roughly $85,000, or in today's money, $1.3 million. In a 1924 newspaper article about the company, Stebbins stated that he attributed their success to their policy of carrying only high-class lines of paint products, and wallpaper, and to plenty of advertising in the newspapers. Indeed, Stebbins and Roberts placed advertisements at least 3 times per week in local newspapers, and continued to do so throughout the 1950s. Stebbins was eventually elected the president of the Little Rock Paint Dealers Association in 1925. Articles for incorporation for the Stebbins-Roberts was filed in 1927 by A.H. Stebbins, his wife Hilda Stebbins, and Carla Langer. The total amount of authorized stock was $75,000, with a $50,000 capital that in place to begin the charter, which is roughly a $736,000 down payment. The certificate of incorporation states that the nature of the business is the wholesale and retail purchase and sale of paints, oils, varnishes, paint accessories, and materials, wallpaper, and novelties. Not really sure what all falls under novelties, but I'm sure they have. The company prospered after the incorporation and was often prominently featured in the Arkansas Gazette, in addition to numerous advertisements placed by Stebbins and Roberts. Additionally, exposure was given to the company in the form of an interview-style advertorials, which were kind of like editorials, but with advertisements in them, such as the 1928 article entitled, "Tinting of Walls is Highly Recommended," published in the Real Estate and Industry section in the Arkansas Gazette. In the article, Stebbins described one of the products sold in his company, saying it is refreshing in dainty shades, and stating that the chosen colors of the interior can be an influence for good on the people people who are surrounded by them. In 1931, Stebbins purchased all of Roberts' shares in the company, and new articles of incorporation were filed in 1944. These indicate that the business had expanded, listing the processing and/or manufacture from raw and other materials of paints, oils, varnishes, enamels, putty, and similarly associated products. By that time, the company had a retail operation out of its original West 6th Street location, but also had warehouses and manufacturing facilities in various other parts of the city. Following World War II, Stebbins and Roberts experienced massive growth, with 1946 being the most lucrative year in the company's history. By this time, they had grown to selling products in 8 surrounding states in addition to Arkansas. This is likely due to a surge in housing construction for returning soldiers. To accompany this growth, Stebbins and Roberts built a new office and factory building in the East End near their existing warehouse facilities. At this time, A.H. Stebbins' son, A.H. Stebbins Jr., was on the board and owned the second highest amount of shares. The other board members included his mother, Hilda Stebbins, and J. Sterling Adamson, who was a longtime employee of the company. The construction of the new building was announced in the Arkansas Gazette in May of 1947 and stated that the building permit had been obtained and the cost of a 1-story brick and concrete building would be $100,000, roughly $1.2 million in today's money. A greater portion of H. Ray Burks was the architect for the project, and he explained in our article that a greater portion of the 21,000 square foot building would be devoted to the warehouse space. The section of the building would also be designed to accommodate additional stories in which Mr. Stebbins plans to locate his paint factory later. And the front portion was to be utilized as offices and a lounge with a kitchen and display room. So I don't know if you drove around the building, but you'll see the back section is 2 stories currently. That second floor wasn't there when the building was first completed. It was a completely 1-story building. In 1950, new articles of incorporation were filed in order to expand the offerings of the business. In addition to manufacturing paint and selling wallpaper, the company also sold varnishes, oils, fillers, stains, enamels, mortar and cement, putty, glass, and cleaning materials, or cleaning chemicals. The company continued to expand into the early 50s, opening a branch warehouse in Fort Worth, Texas, and Oklahoma City. And then also opening a subsidiary company to have their own line of paintbrushes. Additionally, the company did their first big expansion on the building during this time, which included adding the second floor to the rear of the building and expanding the office space section. Which you can see on the front of the building where the sunshade ends, but the office kind of still keeps going. That section is the expansion. The first year, however, this expansion in business was not immediately successful. The first 3 years of the 1950s saw drought, labor problems, and shortages in operating capital. Additionally, overall paint sales in the nation were down by 7%. However, business improved by the late 1950s and into the 60s, and the company received several high-profile supply contracts, such as the formulation of a clear varnish that was to be applied to the gold leaf dome of the Arkansas State Capitol. However, by the late 1960s, the warehouse was once again too small, which resulted in the decision to build an expansion a second time, adding a large wing to the east, which is actually where we are now. This addition was completed in 1971. Sales began to continuously drop, though, in the 1970s due to the arrival of discount chains and large home improvement stores, which by 1976 were capturing 45% of the paint market. The company was profiled in Arkansas Business Journal in 1985 after the company embarked on a major sales and marketing improvement plan and facility modernization efforts. The article reported that Stebbins and Roberts employed about 100 people, including 20 in the general offices and 25 in the manufacturing plant, the remainder of which were distributed between their different centers and 5 different company-owned stores. The company was among the top 100 of the 1,700 paint manufacturers nationally. The company name changed to Sterling Paints, though, in 1995, when Jim Adamson, son of longtime employee and former president Sterling Adamson, took over as president. In 2003, Sterling Paints was acquired by Iowa Paints, and shortly after that, they closed down their facilities as they already had their own manufacturing facilities. In 2016, the Cromwell firm purchased the building and to renovate into their new offices. A little bit about the Cromwell firm, who's the current tenants. The history of the Cromwell firm actually began around 1885, making the Cromwell firm the longest continuously operating architectural firm west of the Mississippi in the country. The firm began when Benjamin J Bartlett opened a practice in the original Capitol Theater building. There was 3. This was the first one at 215 West Markham Street. And the Capitol Theater building was actually one of his designs. He had been chosen to design the new Arkansas School for the Blind, which was originally located roughly where the Arkansas Governor's Mansion is now. In 1886, he hired a young draftsman, Charles L Thompson, to assist him with his work. Thompson was just shy of his 18th birthday when he had responded to an advertisement in a lumber journal for a position in the office of Benjamin Bartlett, which brought him to Arkansas. In 1887, the firm moved out of the Capitol building into the Oddfellows building at between 314 and 324 West Markham, just down the street from their previous location. The next year, in 1888, Bartlett made Thompson his partner. In 1890, Bartlett received a commission to design a new courthouse in Rosendale, Mississippi, and decided to pursue other opportunities there, so he turned the entire firm over to Thompson that same year. And unfortunately, the Oddfellows building, which is where they're located at the time, there are no photos of it. Like, this is the only image we have of the building, and it's burned shortly after they moved out. In 1891, Thompson moved his firm to the Alice Block, which had been constructed in 1870 and designed by Little Rock architect Thomas Harding. And it was located at 301, 311 West Markham, more or less right across from the old State House. And it was formerly called Brothers Block, and later it was called the Arkansas Block and Polk Block. So figuring out where people were during this time was really complicated because they just keep changing the name of the same building. Also in 1891, Thompson took a partner of Fred Ricken, who was an engineer. And this is actually one of the earliest known occurrences in the country where an architect and an engineer were in the same office. However, this partnership only lasted for 6 years. In 1907, the firm moved from the Alice Block into the Southern Trust Bank building, which had been completed in 1905 and was designed by architect George R. Mann. This building still exists, obviously. There's a picture of it today. And it's located in the 200 block of 2nd Street. In 1916, Thompson once again took a partner, Thomas Harding Sr. There's a lot of Thomas Hardings, so they get confusing too. So there's Thomas Harding, and then Thomas Harding Sr. is actually the son of Thomas Harding, and then Thomas Harding, and then Thomas Harding Jr. So, and they all overlap, and they work for the same people, it gets bad. So he took a partner, Thomas Harding Sr., who was the son of notable Thomas Harding I. And he had begun, Thomas Harding Sr. actually had begun working in Thompson's firm in 1898 and displayed an early talent for design. His abilities allowed him to progress up through the firm quickly and led Thompson to believe that he could add a more contemporary eye to the firm's work. Their partnership lasted until 1925, when Harding began pursuing his own practice. 1926 saw two major changes in the Thompson firm. The first was when Thompson decided to merge his firm with the firm of Sanders and Ginocchio, who had operated together since 1918. The new firm, called Thompson, Sanders, and Ginocchio, and Frank Ginocchio had actually worked for Thompson previously in his life. He was originally a draftsman and then kind of became more or less a project supervisor and detail architect. However, when he was discharged from the military after World War I, Thompson had already taken a partner, Thomas Harding. And so Mr. Ginocchio, whose feelings were a little hurt, he really wanted that position, decided that he was just going to go play by himself until he met up with his friend Sanders and they started their own firm. Due to the increase in the firm's size, they needed a new space. The Southern Trust building no longer worked, so they moved into the 1923 Hall building at 209 West Capitol, which Sanders and Ginocchio had actually designed. The firm would stay in the Hall building for the next 28 years. In 1938, Charles Thompson retired from the firm, and the name was changed back to Sanders and Ginocchio. In 1941, Theo Sanders retired from the firm, but that same year, Ginocchio offered a partnership to Edwin Cromwell, who was Thompson's son-in-law. He had been working at the firm of Wittenberg and Deloney, but he decided that working for his father-in-law's firm would be a much better opportunity, so he moved over, and the firm became Ginocchio and Cromwell. In 1947, the name changed again. The firm had a massive expansion, and they had a lot of very talented architects working for them, and they wanted to recognize them, but they couldn't make them all named partners. So they added the associates just to recognize that they did have very talented people working for them. In 1954, the firm was again in need of more space, so they moved to 416 Center Street, into a building they had renovated to project a more modern sensibility of the practice. They would stay in this location for 21 years. In 1961, the firm's name changed to Ginocchio, Cromwell, Carter, Dees, and Neeland. However, Ben Dees passed away in 1962, so the firm's name changed again to Ginocchio, Cromwell, Carter, and Neeland, Incorporated. After the deaths of Frank Ginocchio and Charles Carter in 1969, the firm's name changed again to Cromwell, Neeland, Trumper, Millet, Gatchell, Incorporated. This was followed by another name change in 1974 to Cromwell, Neeland, Trumper, Levy, Gatchell, Incorporated, following the death of Robert Millet that year. In 1975, the firm wanted more space again. They were continuing to grow. They had taken on numerous contracts, both civic, commercial, and residential. So they just needed more space. So they decided to design a new structure for themselves at Spring and Markham, which was essentially where they started out. They moved into their new space in May of 1975. And in 1981, the firm became Cromwell, Trumper, Levy, Parker, and Woodsmall, Incorporated. Following the retirement of Dietrich Neeland and the death of Ollie Gatchell that year, which is why their names dropped off. 3 years later, Edwin Cromwell retired from the firm after 43 years with the company. So the name changed. I'm sorry. And then in 1988, the firm's name changed from Cromwell to Cromwell, Trumper, Levy, Thompson, and Woodsmall. In 2000, the firm decided, in the year 2000, the firm decided to rebrand itself for the coming millennium. They finally settled on the name Cromwell and Cromwell Architects Engineers in honor of the man who made the company such a pillar in design in the design community. Although if you ask me, I think the reason they just simplified down is because they just ran out of letterhead space. In 2016, the firm thought they needed a change of scenery, so they purchased the 1947 Stebbins and Roberts building and set about renovating and restoring it so that they could also help to redevelop Little Rock's East Village area. And then in 2019, with renovations complete, they moved into their new space in the historic building. Said at the beginning, this historic building was designed by the Little Rock firm of Burks and Anderson in 1947. H. Ray Burks, whose first name was Harvey, which doesn't appear in anything. I found one source that called him Harvey. Everybody else just calls him H. He was born in 1890 in Monticello. He studied architecture at Washington University in St. Louis, where he graduated around 1914. In 1915, he went to work for a local architect in Monticello named W.A. Haley, before moving to Little Rock in 1917 to work with the architect James H. Bliss. He stayed with Bliss until he opened his own practice in 1922. Over the following 23 years, Burks created and maintained a very successful practice, designing many beautiful civic and residential buildings across the state. 2 examples of courthouses during this time. However, Burks became very well known for his Art Deco designs, some of the most notable being his 1931 Arkansas County Courthouse in DeWitt, the 1931 Hope County Courthouse in Russellville, the 1934 Municipal Building in Monticello, the 1937 Little Rock Museum of Fine Arts, now the Arkansas Arts Center, and that is actually still in the middle of the building. The original Art Deco building is still there. And also the 1937 University of Arkansas School of Medicine building, now the University of Arkansas William H. Bowen School of Law in MacArthur Park. And it should be noted, all of these were actually built using New Deal funds, most of them being WPA funds, which is the Work in Progress Administration under FDR. In 1945, Burks formed a partnership with Bruce Anderson, which lasted until Burks' death in 1948. Bruce Roy Anderson was born in Newport, Arkansas in 1907, but spent the majority of his youth in Little Rock. After graduation, Anderson studied architecture at the Alabama Polytechnic Institute, now Auburn University, where he graduated in 1929. After which he returned to Little Rock to work for the firm of Wittenberg and Deloney from 1929 to 1930, followed by a stint with Arthur McAninch from 1930 to 1934. Later that same year, he was awarded a scholarship to study at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he obtained his master's degree in architecture in 1935. He then worked for a brief time in Houston for architect Alfred Finn, but returned to Little Rock in 1937. Upon his return, he entered into a partnership with his former employer, Arthur McAninch, which lasted until 1938. From 1939 to 1941, Anderson operated a solo practice, but with the outbreak of World War II, he joined the military. From 1942 to 1945, he served as a U.S. Army captain at the Pine Bluff Arsenal, where he was the chief of the engineering branch. Following the war, he partnered with H. Ray Burks, which lasted 3 years. During this time, the pair designed Little Rock's War Memorial Stadium, which we toured last month, in addition to the Stebbins and Roberts building, and at least 2 buildings on the campus of the Arkansas State Teachers College, which is now UCA, which are these 2 photos here. This was the teaching school, where they practice on campus, and then also their industrial arts building. Neither of these exist. Following Burke's death, Anderson returned to his solo practice and designed a number of buildings around the state, including much of the campus of the University of Central Arkansas in Conway, as well as Harding University and Ouachita Baptist University in Arkadelphia, until his retirement in 1981. Anderson passed away just 4 years later, in 1985. And here's some of his buildings. Ferguson Chapel and Torreson Hall, or Torreson Library, both the UCA and Torreson Library. It's kind of there, but not really. Kindle Hall is on the campus of Harding. The architecture of the building, the design aesthetic of this building, as we said, was an example of the late Art Deco architecture with Art Moderne accents. Art Deco came to be in 1925 at the International Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes in Paris, France, from which the name derived. No one wanted to say all that, so they just shortened it to Art Deco. The style manifested in architecture, art, fashion, and product design, and could be seen as a revolt against the rationing and austerity imposed by the First World War, because Art Deco is generally associated with being very lavish, bright metal materials, shiny, and very decorative. The architecture was characterized by a combination of simple geometric forms with stylized decorative elements and a generally vertical feel to the overall building. It was meant to embody the modern machine age in a non-traditional built form. In the Stebbins and Roberts building, you can see the Art Deco stylings and the general kind of boxiness of the building. See how everything's very rectangular. You don't have a lot of flourishes, things just kind of hanging out for no reason. But also in the 3 decorative panels above the main entrance and to either side, which depict a stylized ionic column. Though Art Deco architecture fell out of favor in much of the country during World War II due to its promotion of excess, there are still a few nice examples of it built in Arkansas in the years immediately following the war. Art Moderne, which is the other kind of style that has touches of it, which is also called Streamline Moderne, had a generally horizontal feel to it, in opposed to the vertical of the Art Deco. The architectural style was meant to be an embodiment of movement and transportation, and was characterized by sweeping, bold curves and horizontal banding. The style is thought to have had its beginning at the 1933 Chicago's World Fair, and it was heavily influenced by the Italian futurist architecture of the 19-teens. Elements of this style seen on the building are primarily in the recessed brick bands, or the cast stone band, which you can kind of see running all the way across the building, giving a much more horizontal feel, but also in the recessed brick bands that crisscross it. And the series of recessed brick courses between the facade windows, like these courses right here, having those recessed courses there was actually kind of a trademark of the Art Moderne style. Also, the cast stone projecting sunshades on the top of the window, which you can see one here, and there's also one over the front door. I don't know what I just did. Ah! I didn't stop pressing buttons over there. So anyway, over the front door was another example. And we're back. So anyway, we'll just stand over here. Even though the high architectural details are really only relegated to the office portion of the building, which is the front, there are some really interesting details on the inside in the warehouse space, such as the board form concrete. And if you look closely at it, it's harder to see now with all of the office and stuff, but before, which this is taken before Carmel moved in, you can actually still see the graining from the wood forms that they used when they poured all of this concrete. And it's pretty impressive. You can kind of see here that massive expanse of ceiling and all of that being board form concrete. It's kind of incredible. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation there with a little bit of history on the building. We especially like to thank Haley Wilcox of OG Preservation and Lily McRae from Cromwell Architects and Engineers. Their research really contributed a lot to our information on this. Thank you for coming. You guys have your